Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History 5 podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor John Kloppenborg. And today we're discussing his debate with Professor Mark Goodacre, hosted by Bart Ehrman. And if you want to view the debate, the link to it will be in the description below and the pinned comment where you can go purchase access to the debate. And the topic specifically that they were debating on is, did Q exist? Q is a hypothetical text that is thought to be a source for Matthew and Luke's double tradition material, sayings of Jesus not found in Mark, but Matthew and Luke have. That being said, John, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Just to recap, can you tell the audience a bit more about Q, especially for people that maybe some people that are watching this may have not ever heard of it before or don't know much about it?
Well, Q is a postulate of one particular understanding of the relationship among the Synoptic Gospels. If you see the Ehrman's podcast, you'll see that it was divided into 4 lectures. The first lecture was simply establishing that there is a literary relationship among the first 3 Gospels. By literary, I mean somebody has copied somebody else. These are not 3 independent versions of the Jesus story. There's some kind of dependence of one on the other, and analyzing the particular pattern of agreements and disagreements among Matthew, Mark, and Luke suggests that Mark is medial. That is, in some way, Mark is the middle term between the other 2. The second lecture, which was Professor Goodacre's, argued pretty clearly and convincingly, I think, that Mark is the earliest of the 3, and that Mark is the source of the other 2. That is, Matthew and Luke have used, they have both independently used Mark as a source. That leads to another problem, another question, and that is Matthew and Luke agree not only in a certain amount of Markan material, but they agree with each other about 235 verses of text, or about 4,500 words, which they didn't get from Mark. So that leaves the question, did Matthew use Luke, or did Luke use Matthew in order to get those 4,500 words of text? Or if they didn't, then we have to account for them in another way. And that's the reason for positing a as yet unknown source, or no longer known source, which we call Q, which stands for the German word Quelle, or source. And so that gives us what's called the 2-document hypothesis. That is, Matthew and Luke have both used Mark as a source, and they've used another source that we call Q, and that contains mostly sayings of Jesus, some sayings of John the Baptist, parables, the skeleton of the Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain, a number of other mostly sayings material that Matthew and Luke agree on, which they didn't get from Mark. So that's what Q is. Now, Professor Goodacre doesn't think that Matthew and Luke are independent of one another. That is, using your diagram here, that there's I think that there's no lines that should be drawn between Matthew and Luke, such that Luke got his 4,500 words from Matthew. But if you do draw a line there, then there's no reason for positing Q. That is, the 4,500 words of text is exactly what Luke copied from Matthew. So the substance of the debate, if you want to call it that, that we had last week was we both, in fact, agreed that Mark is the earliest of the 3 Gospels, and that Matthew and Luke have both used Mark. Where we disagreed is on this issue of whether Luke knew Matthew or Luke didn't know Matthew. And if Luke didn't know Matthew, then we have to account for those 4,500 words in another way. And I think the obvious way of accounting for them is to posit a Q. If Luke did know Matthew, then you don't need to posit Q. So that's basically the substance of the debate and what Q actually is. as we imagine it to be.
Brianna, thank you for becoming a member. Appreciate it. Slower Knight, thank you for your super chat. Was Quella a person? Who?
No, Quelle just means source in German, and that's where the initial Q comes from. So it's a written source that, according to the hypothesis, Matthew and Luke independently used and independently combined with Mark. We have no idea who the author might be, although we also don't really have much of an idea who the authors of the other three Gospels were either. For convenience, we call them Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but none of the texts actually identify the author, and none of them begins with I, Mark, on such and such a year, wrote the following account, or I, Matthew, and so forth. So Quella is simply the name of the source itself. The author of that source, we have no idea, and no way of knowing who the author might have been.
When I had Mark Goodacre on to talk about the debate, but this was before the debate actually happened, um, he was trying to argue that again. I wanted to show a clearer image of the Farrer hypothesis because the arrows
Mhm.
didn't quite
Sure.
show in the earlier image I used. But the um, he says the minor agreements is a strong argument for saying that Luke knew Matthew. But the second thing that he also brought up, and I definitely and I like your response to both of these points, is he has the minor agreements being evidence that Luke knew Matthew. And the second thing is the Mark Q overlaps. He sees that as being a vulnerability to the Q theory because Mark seems to have elements that are more primitive than what's imagined to be in Q, like the baptism but it lacks the water and fire components that are in Q, and in Matthew and Luke. Now, some claim that Mark knew Q, but he says that Matthew was developing double tradition off of those so-called Mark Q overlaps. At least that's the implication. That's
Yeah.
how I took it of what he's
Yeah.
saying. What is your thoughts on both of those points?
Well, on the minor agreements, the when we posit that Matthew and Luke independently used Mark, that is, that Matthew didn't see what Luke did to Mark, and Luke didn't see what Matthew did to Mark, and similarly with their use of the Q material, we shouldn't expect places where both Matthew and Luke modified Mark, added to, subtracted from, changed in exactly the same way. Now, they do. There's a number of places where Matthew and Luke have exactly the same thing as Mark, but they didn't get it from Mark. So, one kind of notorious example of this is in the healing of the ruler's daughter, where in Mark, the woman says to herself, "If only I touch his cloak, I'll be healed." Whereas both Matthew and Luke say, "If only I touch the fringe crespidu of his garment, I will be healed." Now, if Matthew and Luke are completely independent of one another in editing Mark, it's at least a little puzzling that they both use the same term, fringe, of the garment in this story. And there's a number of other there's 6 or so really difficult places where you wonder, is this a coincidence, or does the coincidence really means that Matthew has used Luke or Luke has used Matthew? Um, Many of those minor agreements, I should say, are pretty easily resolved. Mark has a habit of connecting independent clauses with the word and. So you get, and Jesus did this, and he went there, and. It's bad Greek, it's bad English. And both Matthew and Luke have a pretty strong tendency to convert some of those and clauses into properly subordinate clauses using but or the, then, or whatever. And sometimes they do it exactly in the same way. So that's certainly a coincidence, but it's hardly an odd coincidence that Matthew and Luke, both correcting Mark's Greek, are occasionally going to correct it in exactly the same way. But as I say, there are a residual number of cases where it's a little harder to explain. It's not that people haven't explained this. Um, my view is there's. Let me give you a couple of examples of the explanations. One of the earliest explanations that was given simply appealed to the transmission of the text of the Gospels in the second, third, and fourth century, where a scribe copying, let's say, Luke's Gospel, um, uh, also knows Matthew's Gospel. So it's not a matter of the author of Luke knowing Matthew. It's a matter of a scribe of Matthew and Luke knowing both of them. And so when that scribe comes to the woman saying in Matthew, if only I touch, because the scribe knows that Luke's version says fringe, he simply substitutes fringe. I mean, we know by looking at textual transmission that this kind of harmonization happened all the time. That is, a scribe who happened to know Matthew's gospel but was copying Mark or even copying John had a real strong tendency to assimilate one to the other. So that doesn't mean that they were originally assimilated. It means the assimilation has occurred in the process of transmission. And as I said, this is a very commonly known phenomenon. There's other ways. I mean, you could also say it's just a coincidence, but I'm a little bit hesitant to say that they've both coincidentally ended up with the same term, crespidou, fringe, at exactly the same location. But there's several other ways of dealing with this. One scholar who wrote 700 or 800 pages on the minor agreements, Andreas Enulat, argued that all of the minor agreements are post-Markan. That is, they all look like they are developments of Mark's text, which Matthew and Luke then used. Now, that's positing an unknown in order to solve a problem, but it's, since we don't have an original of Mark's gospel, our earliest copy of Mark's gospel is more than a century or a century and a half after it was composed. There's at least going to be some developments of Mark due to textual transmission. And similarly with Matthew and Luke, we don't have first century copies or early second century copies of either of them. We've got at earliest very small fragments in the second century of Matthew, and Luke a little bit later. But so we're not actually looking at anything like the originals of Matthew, Mark, Luke. There's going to be some changes. And that makes it difficult to know whether the minor agreements can be explained as a matter of simply coincidental editing, or that there's been textual interference or corruption between one gospel or another, or there are actually or other versions of Mark that are hanging around that Matthew and Luke have used. So my sort of assessment of the minor agreements problem is it's not that we don't have good answers. We've got too many good answers and we don't know which one to pick. So that's really not, I think, fatal to the two document hypothesis. The other issue about Mark Q overlaps. So we've got a number of them. That is the prediction of a coming one or a stronger one that occurs in Mark and in also Matthew and Luke, where they agree with each other against Mark. They all have a temptation story. They all have a request for a sign. They all have a version of the parable of the mustard seed. And they all towards the end, parallel to Mark 13, they have some speculations upon which Matthew and Luke agree on false messiahs or false prophets or something like that appearing. And the warning is don't believe them or don't follow them when they happen. So there's a number of sort of common incidents. if it were the case that Q, as it was reconstructed, uh, uh, is uh, uh, is so identical to what Mark is, then we would say, well, surely there's no reason for positing a Q at all. They're simply using Mark and they're changing it in various ways. But that's not the case. We've got about 6 incidents um, where there's some agreements between Matthew and Luke against Mark that entitles one to posit a Q version. But one of the characteristics of those Mark Q overlaps is that they always involve much more speech material. So, to take one example, um, Mark, in predicting the coming of somebody that he calls the stronger one, he says, he attributes to John the Baptist, I baptize you with water, but the stronger one is coming, whose sandals I am not fit to carry. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. Both Matthew and Luke, and therefore Q, they use the term the coming one, not the stronger one, and in the way they have constructed their oracle, where Mark is comparing the two baptisms. I baptize with water, but he will baptize with the Holy Spirit. Matthew and Luke both compare the one who is to come, and they call him Haerchomenos, the coming one. Um, so it begins with ego. Mark, John the Baptist says, but the coming one is stronger, and so forth. But both of them also then elaborate what this baptism is. They both say he will baptize with water and fire. I'm sorry, he will baptize with the Holy Spirit and with fire. And then it continues in both cases. His winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear the threshing floor. The wheat he will gather into his granary, and the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire. That's not in Mark at all. So you get a scenario where Mark has a short piece, and then Matthew and Luke have a much longer speech with agreements in the speech material. The temptation story works the same way. Mark has a 2-verse temptation story. Jesus was 40 days in the wilderness, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts. The Matthew-Luke version from Q have the 3 temptations also. The devil, he's not called the Satan there, he's called the devil in Q. So the devil comes with 3 temptations. Turn these stones into bread. Throw yourself on the parapet of the temple, and the angels will carry you, and bow down and worship me, and I will give you all the kingdoms of the world. So none of that is in Mark. So it's again those Mark Q overlaps typically have a very short Markan bit and a much longer Matthew Luke bit. That is a Q bit, where it features a lot more speech material, on which Matthew and Luke agree. So we got about 6 of those, and they all have exactly the same characteristics. So yes, Mark and Q overlap, but their overlaps are of a very different character. And if you ask the kind of abstract question, if you had 2 independent accounts of what Jesus said and did, what are the odds that they're going to agree on some of them? That they're going to agree on something about John the Baptist. They're going to agree on a parable or 2. They're going to agree on another detail like a temptation story or something like that. And they do. Now, apart from those, I think, normal kinds of overlaps, Mark and Q go in entirely different directions. That is, Mark's gospel features many miracle stories and exorcisms, very few parables, no Sermon on the Mount or anything like that, whereas Matthew and Luke, that is Q, have relatively few miracle stories, really only 2, a great deal of speech material, the Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain, lots of parables, and so forth. So sure, they overlap, but I think it would be very peculiar if, as I say, 2 independent accounts of the importance of Jesus never agreed on a single item. That would be very peculiar.
We got a couple of super chat questions. Solera Knight again, thank you for another super chat. Originals Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. Who named them? Why?
If you're talking about, I don't know about a Q4.
I think Solera is talking about the different redactions of the layering of Q. Like
Yeah, okay.
Mac.
I'm
That's
not
what-
aware of anybody talking about a Q4, but now that was based on an analysis of the contents of Q and an attempt to arrive at a kind of composition history. This is one of the things I did. A number of other people have picked up or agreed or come up with something similar. That is, this was an attempt to see if we could figure out, or if I could figure out, and others, how it was that Q had been composed. That is, what the kind of core materials in Q were, and what were then subsequent additions. And at least in my doctoral dissertation, I argued that Q originated as a collection of what are called teaching speeches, and we know a lot of those from Egyptian wisdom literature. They all tend to use the second person plural imperative. They typically begin with some kind of a programmatic statement, like "Blessed are the poor," something like that. Then move into a number of second person plural imperatives, and then finish with a concluding visualization. And in Q, at least as I analyze it, there's 6 of those, but those have also been supplemented by adding a number of largely polemical materials. And I thought that there was at least a couple of pieces: the Sermon on the Mount, the Temptation of Jesus, and the statement about the perdurance of the law, that really didn't fit with either of those 2 layers. So I ended up with sort of 2 main layers, and then a couple of additions, which you could call Q3. I don't know that anyone has posited a Q4, but as I say, this was an attempt to arrive at a kind of compositional history. I'm, that's certainly not the only way that people have thought about the composition of Q. Harry Flederman and others just think it was thrown together as it now stands, and there are no layers. Others, one of my predecessors, Dieter Luhrmann, thought that it was redacted. He doesn't call this Q2, but we might. Sayings of Jesus were then redacted, especially by adding a kind of series of polemical statements that featured opposition to this generation, which is one of the terms that Q uses. So there you might have sort of 2 layers of Q, or an original composition plus some editing. These are all very hypothetical. I mean, after all, we're trying to do compositional history on a document that itself has to be reconstructed from Matthew and Luke. So it's a hypothesis built on top of a hypothesis. So it's, it was an interesting experiment, but that's what it was. It was an experiment to see if we could figure out how Q was composed.
Michael, thank you for your super chat. What do you think of Douglas Ockman's proposal that Jesus acted as a mediator between tax collectors and sinners, to help resolve their tax debt problems?
Yeah, I like Ockman's work a lot. It doesn't have anything especially to do with Q or Mark. This is really a kind of different issue. But what's interesting in both the Q and the Markan material is that both of those composers know about tax collectors or tax gatherers, and both of them also know about the poor. And we do know actually quite a bit about tax collection in the ancient world. There's a recent second doctoral thesis by a German colleague named Alia Almansi on tax collecting in the ancient world. So one of the interesting features about Q are the sayings attributed to Jesus that are directed either about tax collectors or directed at them, that imagine that tax collectors might have the ability, well, tax collectors clearly did have the ability to remit taxes. Taxation system in the ancient world was a kind of system of private entrepreneurs who bought tax contracts from the Roman government and then were empowered to collect back taxes in order to make up what they had agreed to pay, plus some kind of surplus. So there was, a good amount of wiggle room in the taxation system. And a tax collector was also perfectly able to kind of forget about the taxes owing from one family or from one person. And I think that's the model that Doug Oakman has in mind. That is, tax collectors could be persuaded to or convinced that that taxation that taxes could be remitted. That's actually, of course, a feature of the Lord's Prayer. What gets translated in King James English is "forgive us our trespasses." The term is apholema, which means debt. Forgive us our debts as we forgive those who are indebted to us. Um, so, and that's a Q text. That's the Lord's Prayer comes right out of Q, and that seems to imply that the authors of Q, speaking on behalf of Jesus, are suggesting that they engage in a kind of different economic practice that involves the remission of debts, which would include probably taxes. Uh, uh, and notice that it's coordinated with a petition to the divine. Forgive us our apholema, our apholemata. Forgive us our debts, thinking of them as that sins or misdeeds against God are like a debt. As we forgive those who are indebted to us, they're talking about real financial debts. So I think Doug's point, and I've argued this too, is that Q is imagining a kind of new way of living that that thinks about debt and taxes and so forth in a very different way than somebody like Pontius Pilate or Herod Antipas might think of those things. So it's a kind of a modification to an economic system by the followers of Jesus.
Hi, Fish and Ty, thank you for your super chat. Obscure Jewish texts say the source of the gospel is Simon Clopas, the cousin of Jesus and second bishop. Could he be the Q author? Have you ever read this?
Well, I know about Simon Clopas, but the problem is that we have no idea what text they're talking about. So could it be Q? I suppose it could be Q. It could be anything. But in order to make any kind of reasonable conclusions, you actually have to have a text to look at, and in that case, we don't. So, one of my PhD supervisor used to say, everything is possible, but we actually need some data to create plausible arguments. And so, sure, all things are possible, but since there's absolutely no basis on which to make that kind of decision, you can't say anything about it, or I can't say anything about it.
Do we have manuscript evidence in which, because I think there were some scholars that try to argue that there is some manuscript evidence of Markan variants that may infer possible evidence for a deuteromark to explain the minor agreements?
Yes. So this was Andreas Enolat again. So he's paying attention not only to when Matthew and Luke disagree with Mark, that is one of these so-called minor agreements, but he's paying attention also to the textual tradition of Mark to see whether there's any evidence in the textual tradition that there are other versions of Mark. The difficulty here, as I said before, is that the the time span between when we think Mark was composed, let's say around 70, and 230, which is the date of P45, our earliest text of Mark, the span is so large that there's probably going to be some changes that happened, either another edition of Mark or at least copyist changes to Mark. And so this is really a kind of, this is a dead zone. You just don't know what was there. But there are there's certainly places. One of the other minor agreements is a very interesting one. So in Mark's story of Jesus' arrest and hearing before Jewish authorities, it said he was blindfolded and struck, and they said, "Prophesy." Now, both Matthew and Luke have that story. Matthew has the blindfolding, Luke doesn't, but they both agree, not only in saying prophesy, but prophesy who struck you. That's a real notorious minor agreement, because Matthew and Luke have 6 words that Mark doesn't have. But if you look at the textual tradition, you'll see that scribes had a tendency to supplement Mark with the phrase "who struck you," and there's other kind of textual disturbances in the transmission of Matthew 26 and Luke 22 that at least one might think that there's another version of Mark around. I don't. As I said, the problem is that the earliest manuscript of Mark is so much later than the original of Mark that it really is a pretty difficult argument to make plausibly. If we had, something from the early 2nd century that was slightly different from Mark, then you would say, well, maybe we've got a Deutero-Mark there, or an Or-Marcus, or something like that. But that's just not the case. So it's text transmission turns out not to help us very much on that Mark 14:65 piece. It still remains a possibility that there's either textual corruption or a second version of Mark. But being able to propose something and being able to construct a plausible argument in its favor are 2 entirely different matters.
Solar Knight, thank you for another super chat. Matthew Levy, a despised tax publican. Why chosen?
Yeah, that's so. This goes back to the story in Mark 2 of the call of Levi, where his name is Levi, son of Alphaeus. If you look at the parallels in Matthew and Luke, Luke agrees that his name is Levi, but Matthew has the same story where the tax collector's name is Matthias now. Now, that's in fact the reason that Matthew's gospel is called the Gospel of Matthew, because early transmitters of the gospel saw this change and they thought, well, he must be writing his own name into the story. I mean, that in no way follows logically, but it's certainly an interesting feature that Matthew's gospel has used the name Matthew in the same story where Luke and Mark call him Levi. It's a little bit hard to know why the author of the first gospel would have changed it. Matthias is one of the most common names for a Jewish male in the ancient world, say in ancient Palestine. Levi is also, of course, a good Jewish name, but it also would suggest that tax collector is a Levite, that is, belongs to one of the priestly clans. Who knows why Matthew has made the change. I don't think there's a plausible reason for saying he's writing himself into the story. I think it's more likely that he's picking a non-priestly name to give to this tax collector. We've got another named tax collector now in Luke, and his name is Zacchaeus. That's in Luke 19. We don't have parallel stories in Matthew and Mark for that story, but Luke has a story where the chief tax collector is named Zacchaeus, also a very good Jewish name, but not a Levitical name. That is not a priestly name. So I don't know. That's a puzzle where we don't really have a very good answer for why Matthew decides to change the name at that point.
Zealand's in. Thank you for your super chat. Zealand says thank you. Oh, thank you for the super chat. Appreciate it. The last thing I'd like to ask is when you look at the overall argument of the Farrer hypothesis, they say if you take it all in combination, they have the minor agreements against Mark. They have it. They both have infancy narratives. They both have genealogies of Jesus. They both have the double tradition that we can't really find anywhere else. So and they argue that all of that put together, even if there might be arguments that might make it complicated to understand how Luke knew Matthew, but they say the preponderance of that evidence indicates that Luke knew Matthew one way or the other. What do you make of that overall argument?
Well, I think one has to be careful here, and Mark was pretty careful too. You've used the word evidence. I mean, evidence is data that sort of inextricably points in a certain direction. That actually we don't have. We've got data. We don't have evidence.
That's what I meant.
And the conversation that I had with Mark, we ended up agreeing on so much, and then on some points we ended up disagreeing. The principal point is whether there is sufficient reason to think that Luke had direct access to Matthew or not, and that's really where the argument comes down to. Now, you pointed out some of the interesting sort of agreements between Matthew and Luke. For example, both of them have an infancy story. But if you read the two infancy stories, they're different. In Matthew's case, Jesus is born in Bethlehem, because that's where Joseph's house is. In Luke, his family actually is from Nazareth, and they come to Bethlehem. In Matthew's account, he's born in a house, because it's Joseph's house. That's, of course, where he's born. Luke has the more interesting story of Jesus being born in a stable along with some sheep. In Matthew's gospel, it's the magicians, the magi who come to visit him. In Luke's story, it's the shepherds, and so forth. So, yeah, they both agree that Jesus was born. They both agree that it happened in Bethlehem, and in practically every other detail, they disagree. That's also the case with the resurrection appearance stories. Mark doesn't have them. Matthew and Luke both have them, but they're different stories. They're completely different stories. So one of the challenges for the Farrer hypothesis is to account for why Luke, having seen Matthew's infancy story, doesn't replicate even any of it except for the name Bethlehem and born, or why in the resurrection appearance stories that Luke sees Matthew's stories and doesn't take any of them. And we have similar issues with the material. I mean, if you compare Luke and Matthew carefully, even where they do agree with sentences against Mark, they typically place them differently in a different set of stories. Let me just give you one example of this. So in Q, there is apparently a promise that Jesus makes that in the renewal or in the resurrection or at some point, you will sit on 12 thrones judging the tribes of Israel. Now, Matthew connects that saying with a story in Mark 10 where Mark's story begins with a rich man who says he wants to follow Jesus, and Jesus says, "That's fine. Dispense with all of your possessions and give them to the poor, and then follow me." The man is unhappy about that and goes away sad. And then Peter and the disciples say to Jesus, "Well, we have given up everything to follow you. What about us?" And in Mark's story, Jesus says, those who have given up family and friends and so forth will receive 100-fold back in the resurrection. Now, that's the point at which Matthew plugs in, and you will sit on 12 thrones, judging the tribes of Israel. So both of these sayings, you will get back 100-fold, and the 12 throne sayings are reward sayings, and they fit pretty perfectly with the context in Matthew 19, which is parallel to Mark 10. Now, Luke's got the same sentence, the same thing about 12 thrones, but it's not put there. That is, it's put into the Last Supper in in Luke 22. So one would ask the question, well, if Luke has actually seen the way in which Matthew combined the Q saying, or the, let's say, the 12 throne saying with the Markan context, why did he take the 12 throne sayings out and put them in an entirely different place in his gospel? And after Matthew 4:16, Luke does this consistently on the far hypothesis. He consistently does this. That is, he removes the way in which Matthew has combined a Markan context with another saying. He's taken the other saying, removed it from its Markan context as it appears in Matthew, and put it somewhere else. Now, that's possible. Surely it's possible that the author of Luke has decided to do that. It's a little bit puzzling why he would do that. That is, why he would disarticulate Matthean compositions as they exist in Mark, only to place individual sayings at different places. But on the far hypothesis, he's done that. On the two document hypothesis, both Matthew and Luke are independently editing Mark and independently sticking Q material into Mark. Now, if they're independent, that also accounts for the fact that they make completely different decisions about how they're going to connect a Q text with a Markan context. So the fact that Matthew has decided to connect the 12 throne sayings with Mark 10 and Peter's question, "What about us?" And the fact that Luke has put it into the Last Supper sequence, that's explicable if neither has seen what the other did. And the example that I use is if I give to undergraduates a narrative about Socrates and a bunch of Socrates sayings and ask them to combine them. Well, if I've got 30 in the class, I'm going to end up with 30 different biographies, because the students will have made different choices about how to put a Socratic saying into a Socratic narrative context. If it turned out that they all decided to put it in the same place, I would say, well, somebody's copied from somebody else here. And that's essentially what we've got with the synoptics. That is, we've got a kind of Markan backbone, and we've got sayings material, but Matthew and Luke have made almost completely different decisions about how to house or locate or to peg those sayings. That's what you would expect if they are operating independently of one another. If Luke is always using Matthew for those sayings, you would expect him sometimes at least to agree with the way in which Matthew had combined Markan framework with those sayings material. But after about chapter 4, in both of their cases, they don't agree. So that's a challenge for the Farrer hypothesis. I don't want to imply that that's a fatal problem, but it's certainly a problem that's going to require a lot more thinking and justification than has so far been provided. It's not that there are not problems with the two document hypothesis. There are. Minor agreements are one of the problems. Mark Q overlaps are potentially a problem. I think not a very serious one. But we still end up with a residue of problems that the hypothesis doesn't really address very well. And that's also the case with the Farrer hypothesis. So for me, and I think for Mark too, our solutions to the the synoptic problem, are a matter of, for each of us, coming up with a solution that seems to account for most of the data most of the time by what we both think are the most plausible kinds of explanations. Now, we have different judgments about what are the plausible explanations here, and hence he ends up with the Farrar hypothesis. I end up with the two-document hypothesis. No one has a slam dunk here. There are no proofs on the horizon one way or the other. There's only scenarios that make a lot of sense of a lot of the data, and that's what we're stuck with. And so for me, the two-document hypothesis and the positing of Q make the best sense of the data that we've got. But I'm certainly not going to say that it's been proven, or that the Farrar hypothesis is impossible. That's simply not responsible.
Slur Knight, thank you for your super chat. Maybe offers concern copyright infringements. Well, look, the ancient world wasn't concerned with copyright like we are today.
That's true. And if there were copyright laws, both Matthew and Luke would be in deep trouble.
Efficient Ty, thank you for your super chat. Luke and Matthew disagree too much to say Luke knew.
Knew Matthew, I think. Yeah.
He corrects that here. Luke knew Matthew. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's. I think that's generally true. I mean, my example of the infancy stories, where yes, both of them say that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but they disagree on almost every other detail. Now, one of the things I tell my graduate students is that we're all smart people, and we can, we might be able to come up with an explanation of the extent of the disagreements, but you have to do that. You actually have to come up with an explanation of just why Luke's infancy story is so different from Matthew's. And I'm not willing to say it's impossible to come up with an explanation. One hasn't been given yet, but there's a lot of smart people out there who know ancient literature very well, and maybe someone is able to come up and convince us that it does make sense that Luke would have so massively changed Matthew here. It hasn't been done yet, in my view, and so as long as it hasn't been done, then I think we have to explain those data in a different way. So I agree with your general statement that Luke changes Matthew a lot here, not only in wording but in sequencing. So there's a great deal of editing that's going on. But one of the points that Mark Goodacre made in the debate was, he said he thinks that we've maybe underestimated just how inventive and creative Luke was. Well, go for it. That is, write a book that explains the creative, adventuresome, kind of radical Luke, who did these things to Mark and to Matthew, and make a plausible case for it. That hasn't been done yet, but I don't want to exclude that somebody might in fact be able to come up with a plausible explanation for why Luke disagrees so much with Matthew, and with Mark as well. So, as I say, this is, we're not in the zone of proofs and slam dunk, and winners and losers in this kind of debate, where we're really in the territory of each of us trying to provide meaningful and plausible explanations of the data that we've got, and we end up disagreeing on plausibility, and which is a rather subjective thing, right? It's not a matter that we both got data that's impossible to explain on our hypothesis. What our job is actually to come up with plausible explanations that account for those data, and we've got, there's at least two or probably even three different ways of explaining those data.
I'd like to remind everybody real quick, the link to the debate course will be in the description below and the pinned comment. On top of that, I'll have the links to John's The Earliest Q Gospel, And also, if you want to get really into the technical weeds about the Q source and the synoptic problem, I also recommend Excavating Q as well. Both the links to both books will be in the description below in the pinned comment, along with the debate course as well. That being said, John, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you. Always a pleasure, Jacob.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.